Call a continuous slide, what they call democratic backsliding, or degeneration of a democracy, or democracy that is atrophied, democracy that is not creative and regenerative. It is dying. And in the hands of President Bola Tinubu and his government, I called it the other time, hybrid regime. It's part of what we call competitive authoritarianism. It is neither democratic, neither is totally authoritarian. So there's a recourse to constitution, but the constitution is really abused. It's a recourse to the rule of law, but it's undermined. It's a recourse to to judicial intervention, but the judicial appears already confiscated by the executive branch. It's a recourse, democratic recourse to parliament as an arbiter, sometimes between the people and the executive branch, but parliament seems to have fled. The Senate president, the speaker, and the bunch of characters around them have sold their soul to the presidential, to the president and his people. So you're not going to look at parliament to balance democratic life. You can't look to the judiciary to say, we're going to find justice for the common people, for those who oppose to this government. So democracy in 1999, yes, was innocent in a way, maybe not 100% what we expected democracy to be for the people, but better than what we have today. Today, there's a much more aggressive push to undermine democratic governance. There's a much more aggressive push to actually shut down or dismember the guardrails that hold our democratic practice. The first guardrail will be civic liberty, and human dignity. You find it constantly under assault. Even the Unity Fountain, where they used to have bring back the gear, they've shut it down. They've gated it. It's criminal to even go there to protest. So that's what they used to come to power in 2015. But now criminalize that very act of protest. You saw the pictures some months ago of young people underage, brought to court, some collapsing there. So using the criminal justice system to undermine people's trust in themselves and ability to protest against the unjust governance structures of the day. If our Labour leaders being accused of terrorism and terror financing, if our media practitioners being handed from pillar to post, if our political parties fighting for their lives because the government today would like to break their back. So this government is intentional in the determination to topple almost all those concessions we've been paying to democratic governance over the preceding 2 decades plus. Creating one-party system, which for me is the intent of this government. Maybe not exactly having a one-party system, but having one single party that is exuberant, robust, and cohesive and coherent. They having other parties limping, virtually half dead, half alive. That's like a one-party state, in anything but the name. And when that happens, all the pretenses to liberal democracy are gone. All the pretense to the norms of that democratic system are gone. So what they now find is full-blown illiberalism, totalitarianism. Then become totalitarian if care is not taken. So multi-party democracy, and this is a way of the elite placing checks on one another, different factions of the ruling elite, manifesting themselves in different political formations, trying to balance, the appetite, their greed, their balance for power with the wide expectations of the public. When you don't have that balancing act, you don't have that sense of consensus built among the elite, but just a single party under the leadership of a single individual. It is frightening. Society is one of those. It cannot. A complex country like Nigeria, multi-religious, multi-ethnic, in a sense, multinational, and very diverse, will not cope with the strain and stress imposed upon it by this kind of capricious, dismantle of democratic governance, not the guise of distorting the one-party rule and the multi-party rule. So in essence, all hands must be on deck by labor centers, by civic platforms, by media practitioners, by political activists to ensure the survival of democracy, by the survival of the multi-party system. That is what is going to work for a federal state like Nigeria, and not an insistence of a single party infrastructure that will manage human liberties and civil, and muscle civil space. This question is a foundational question. Yeah. I always say, how foundational? liberal democracy has not only suffered a setback in Nigeria and Africa in general, has run its muffled course. It virtually has failed miserably after almost a 20-30 year reign. Liberal democracy was advertised as almost the cure-all to African crisis of development and crisis of democracy. If you remember the 70s and 80s and the big men syndrome, when you have the very powerful big men in Africa and they refuse to go, Mobutu Sese Seko, Francis Nguema, and the rest of them. So we had 20, 30, 40 years in power with virtually nothing to show for governance and development and democracy building. So liberal democracy came to cure this, to say we now have a system of representative government in a multi-party framework where you have a very strong parliament, you have an independent judiciary, vibrant civil society, etc., and a very credible media. That hasn't worked out well for 30 years. Now Africa is in shambles because of the failure of liberal democracy as an imposed democratic system. Currently, there's a new wave of thought in Africa called decolonial praxis that means going back to African traditional knowledge formation system to say colonialism came with these claims of enlightenment, and enlightenment is based on what we call colonial modernity. That means the barbaric people, when they came to give us clothes to wear, came to give us education and the tongue to speak. That means if they give us anything, we shall accept it. People are questioning that mode of forming, epistemologies. How do you form knowledge? By what you receive from the people to colonize you. You have to go back to the ancient method in which our knowledge systems were formed and then try to drag them into the contemporary stage. That means you can question the very presence of liberal democracy in Africa and find a system that could work for us that is more Afrocentric or African-centered. In 1989, Obasanjo came with Constitution for National Integration and Development, where he formulated a one-party state. But not the current one-party state I criticize now, but a one-party state that is inclusive, like the Chinese Communist Party model, where you have council of leaders, where they have youth representation, women in governance and committees, then you find former heads of state and so on coming together. That African democracy or African civilizational, movement is not contested the way we are contesting power today. It's actually inclusive. Where they find fragmentary, village democracy, where people will talk until they reach consensus. So to build consensus is better than to contest and contend for power. So over contestation, we need to over partisanship, and then criminalities, fraud, wastages, corruption. Do we find a method that may not be one-party state, but a system that owes more to African logic of civilizational evolution rather than an imposed Western method? One of the prime problems of Western liberal democracy is conflating legitimacy and legality. Like I said in my last interview, legality is that the elections held. Bola Tinubu scored 37% of 20% of the 93 million people who registered with INEC. In essence, he had no mandate. But then, there was an election. When a few people turned out to vote, it was counted and proclaimed, and the court ratified it. So it's legal. But legitimate in terms of not performing to the expectations of the people. Hunger in the land, hyperinflation, and so on, criminalities everywhere, corruption. These are things that will undermine legality. But for liberal democracy, once elections have held, governments sworn in, people are coming and going, elections every 4 years, democracy is thriving. No, it is not thriving. Democracy is actually being attenuated. It's backsliding, and it's being consumed by inherent systemic contradictions. What will work will be an African-centered method of democratic governance, leveraging on the creative thought of African practitioners in governance, our scholars, our intellectuals, and those in power, to begin to think that most of these issues are not settled. Nigeria positions they shouldn't be a settled matter because it could be part of our problem. No matter how hard we try to escape these contradictions and inadequacies, we can't come out of it. A governor appoints 3,000 aides. Senate president goes about 50 or 80 car convoy. It's built in the system as legitimate means of expenditure. But this is corruption in full flight, constitutionalized. They have to find a method, of less burdensome government, more accountability, much more affinity with the expectations of the people, much more claims to legitimacy as against advertisement of legality.